First, just a few words about my connection with Father Artigas. I met him about 20 years ago at the Mariano Institute that Marty was mentioning. And then after, he came and spoke at St. John's University, where I teach, a couple of times. And in the last couple of years of his life, we started to collaborate on a project, a general text on philosophy of science for just the average person. And what would happen is he would send me a chapter, and I'd send him about 13 questions. And he'd send back then some answers to the questions, but not to all my questions. And I'm like the little prince. I don't forget a question. And so the next time, I'd send the chapter back with 15 questions. Well, the long and the short of it was, after a while, Father got kind of tired of my questions. And then eventually he got sick, so our collaboration kind of didn't come to an end. But I'm sure he's looking fondly down upon me from heaven. All right. I beg your indulgence. I had to cut down a 25-page paper into a 15-page paper. And even then, I'm going to have to read it quickly, so have a little pity. All right. Sir Arthur Eddington tells a charming parable illustrating the nature of scientism. The fisherman in the story is using a net with 2-inch holes, and after fishing with it, concludes that fish smaller than 2 inches are not to be found in the sea. The moral of the story is that one's method does not determine what exists in reality. Rather, reality determines the adequacy of one's method. What is the reality that modern biology studies? Living things. And although there are some differences in the species we have today and those extant in Aristotle's day, what it is to be a living thing has not changed. Yet the way the father of biology spoke about living things and the way that scientists do today are widely different. Aristotle, in his treatise on the soul, claims that the soul is something that is known with the greatest certitude. And he maintains that investigating what the soul is constitutes a major contribution to the study of nature, as it is key to understanding the life of animals. In sharp contrast is Richard Dawkins' gleeful affirmation that science has either, quote, killed the soul or is in the process of doing so, the conscious mind being the last holdout. Now, biology textbooks generally do not display the same hostile attitude towards the soul. They usually just don't even mention it. Whether hostile or indifferent to the notion of the soul, biologists today certainly do not regard an inquiry concerning the soul as making a substantial contribution to understanding the biosphere. Aristotle distinguished 3 main life forms: plants, animals, and humans, and 4 grades of life, animals being of 2 sorts, immobile and mobile. He saw the grades of life be arranged in a hierarchy of perfection, with human beings being the superior life form. Biologists nowadays often tell us to the contrary, that no type of living thing is better than any other. Each species has its own set of adaptations to its local environment, allowing it to survive, and that's all. And there are a lot of other oppositions that I could name between Aristotle and modern biologists. Now, such radical differences in viewpoints on such fundamental questions about living things makes us wonder if the 2 groups are talking about the same sort of being. Has one or both overlooked basic features of living things? Has the method that either has adopted blinded them to seeing living things for what they are? Are there ideological biases that cause them to overlook or explain away certain features of organisms? In this essay, I will investigate the modern scientific understanding of what a living thing is and the effect this understanding has on how biologists conduct research nowadays. I will do the former primarily by contrasting the modern biologist's understanding of living things with that of Aristotle. The principal points of comparison will concern the respective views on what it means to be alive, whether the notion of soul is expendable, whether purpose or finality is to be found in the living realm, whether there is a hierarchy in the biosphere, and whether human beings are a life form differing in kind from other animals. I will then also consider what effect modern biologists' understanding of living things has on the way they do research. Throughout, I will make a case that biology suffers when biologists lack an educational acquaintance with certain philosophical investigations concerning life, nature, reality as a whole, and our understanding thereof. Okay, first section. Does speaking of a soul add anything to our understanding of living things? Let's begin by considering how Aristotle investigates the nature of the soul. Here's a quote. the starting point of our inquiry is an exposition of those characteristics which have chiefly been held to belong to the soul in its very nature. Two characteristic marks have above all been recognized as distinguishing that which has soul in it from that which has not, namely sensation and motion, end quote. The dog sees someone putting food in its dish. It walks over and has some. It's alive. It's plain from what Aristotle says later on that by movement he means self-motion. For non-living natural things plainly move, but not in any sense on their own. Biologists typically regard living things as machines, rather than as beings that are ensouled. Biologist William Provine tells us that one of the implications of modern science is that, quote, human beings are marvelously complex machines, end quote. And the same is held to be true for other animals as well. Why do biologists nowadays regard living things as machines? Doubtlessly, there is the historical influence of Descartes, who posited that humans have a spiritual soul, but that plants and animals are not essentially different than machines, but simply have smaller parts, being made up out of microscopic cells. This neat, if simplistic division leaves it to science to experiment on and measure different features of the body, and to religion to deal with the spiritual. Descartes' division was also, at least in part, motivated by the discovery of apparent inadequacies in Aristotle's notion of living things moving on their own. Many life activities, such as the circulation of blood, were yielding in Descartes' day to a mechanistic form of explanation. Accordingly, Descartes would say that, quote, it's no less natural for a clock constructed with this or that set of wheels to tell time than it is for a tree which was grown from this or that seed to produce the appropriate fruit. With the right input of energy, processes are set in motion that in one case result in hands moving and in the other case in the production of a fruit. Without doubt, trying to understand different activities of living things in terms of the material parts that make these activities possible has been a wildly successful project. An understanding of many human diseases has been achieved, facilitating the discovery of cures. Certainly, these things were not discovered by reflecting on the nature of the soul. It's one thing, though, to acknowledge that the reductionist method has furthered our understanding of the life processes of living things. It's another to assume that the success of this method has answered the question, are living things essentially machines, or are there fundamental differences between the two? Does Aristotle have an answer to the scientist who argues that nutrition in plants is no more a self-motion than the motions executed by machines are? An electric clock needs to be plugged in and its hands set in order for it to henceforth tell the correct time. Similarly, photosynthesis requires that photons strike the chlorophyll pigments, which are found in the two photosystems, in order for the plant to make sugar from water and carbon dioxide. Both machine and plant need to be started up by an outside agent. Photosynthesis is a part of a greater process whereby the plant transforms materials other than itself into itself. Photosynthesis leads to the production of sugar, which provides both energy for building up new parts of the plant and in some cases a chemical skeleton that will be modified to form parts of the plant. Without photosynthesis, the plant could not generate new cells. Machines, on the other hand, while sharing in common with plants that need to be started up, do not make new parts for themselves. If somehow one could invent a machine that would make replacement parts for itself, there would still be the difference that a machine is not itself, in the sense of being a substance. Although Aristotle never explicitly contrasts living things and machines, he faults his predecessors of crudely materialistic propensities for overlooking a fundamental point about living things. Namely, that when a living thing dies, quote, none of its parts remains the same, except only in shape, just like the animals in the story that were turned into stone, end quote. When a machine breaks down, it can no longer move in a way that allows it to perform its human-assigned function. When a living thing dies, it can no longer move in the ways it used to in view of preserving its life and reproducing. But in addition, when a living thing dies, not only do its parts cease to move in the said way, they cease to be what they were. Granted, at death, not all organic parts lose their ability to function instantaneously. Still, without some special intervention, such as transplanting them, they do so in a relatively short period of time. the broken machine's non-broken parts are not affected in a like manner. When Aristotle speaks of nutrition and growth as self-motion, it would be a mistake to think that he was attributing to plants the kind of self-motion that characterizes a being that has free will. That is, one that has motions that are determined by itself and not by outside factors. While plant and machine both require being moved from the outside in order to then move on their own, again, the difference between the two is that a plant is a substance, a unified whole. The machine is only one thing to the extent that we so arrange its parts to serve a purpose. Thus, even if a machine could make itself new parts, these parts would be made by some motion or change other than a substantial change of some material into the machine's substance, because the machine is not one substance. All right, next section is entitled, "The notions of the soul that Aristotle rejects are often the only notions of soul that biologists are familiar with." All right, so the two notions that we're talking about here are the vitalist notion, that namely the soul is some sort of ethereal substance or some force emanating from this ethereal substance. And Aristotle's predecessors had already thunk that one up. And basically Aristotle says if you have a determinate substance, then the animal is going to act in a determinate way. So a determinate substance could explain why an animal falls down, but not why it gets up. Or if you have jiggling atoms, that explains why the animal is moving, but not why the animal is at rest. So Aristotle rejected that a long time ago. Okay? The other notion is the Cartesian notion that you have this immaterial substance, and then the soul, and then you have a physical body, which is another substance, and now you need a rubber band to put the two together, or maybe a pineal gland. But at any rate, that is definitely not Aristotle's notion of the soul. Here's like the classic passage from Aristotle on how he thinks body and soul are related. Quote, "If then we have to give a general formula applicable to all kinds of soul, we must describe the soul as the first grade of actuality of a naturally organized body. That is why we can wholly dismiss as unnecessary the question of whether the soul and the body are one. It is as meaningless as to ask whether the wax and the shape given it to by the stamp are one, or generally the matter of a thing and that of which it's the matter." End quote. Okay, so again, on a lot of things, then actually Dawkins and Aristotle agree. They both reject these two notions of soul, the vitalist notion of soul and the idea that the soul is a separate substance from the body. However, Aristotle does not reject in advance the possibility that some soul be separable from the body. Okay? And obviously for a soul to be separable from the body, it would have to be immaterial. And this is where Dawkins is going to part company with Aristotle. Okay? So Aristotle, again, he's not going to exclude in advance that the soul is separable from the body, that it's some immaterial thing. And in fact, he regards the human soul with its capacity for abstract thought as plausibly being such. Now, Dawkins rejects this possibility because of his prior commitment to materialism. And obviously, we all know this, but I have to fill it in anyway. Adopting this philosophical view, okay, cannot be justified on the grounds that it's prerequisite for doing science. To understand science's task to be the consideration of the material aspects of natural things does not require one to assume that everything about every type of living thing is material. The methodological net of reductionism does not determine what beings do or do not exist in reality. In other words, embracing methodological reductionism in the pursuit of science does not entail a commitment to ontological reductionism. Dawkins' commitment to materialism is simply an ideology and one which blinds him to whatever non-scientific evidence there may be that a living thing is composed of an immaterial soul and a physical body. This affects Dawkins' vision of living things to the extent that differences between humans and other animals are immediately reduced to material differences. And the latter has repercussions when it comes to a discussion of whether evolutionary history is in any way progressive. This unjustified commitment to materialism is all too widespread among biologists. Aristotle has no such prior commitment, and so he's open to following wherever the evidence leads on whether any type of soul is immaterial. Modern biologists often think that in rejecting the notions of soul as some material or immaterial substance added to the body, that no notion of soul worthy of consideration has been left standing. Yet Aristotle himself rejects the same notions and is proposing another notion which merits consideration, given that it avoids the mistakes associated with these other views. And even if Aristotle's notion of soul is incorrect, biologists, by examining it, would obtain a better grasp of the sort of thing a living thing is. Biologists need to realize that there are aspects of living things that can only be understood by reflecting on common experience, rather than through the detailed experience gained by doing experiments. They would also do well to follow Aristotle in eschewing an a priori commitment to materialism. Okay, the next section is on the soul and consciousness. And when it comes to trying to explain consciousness and related life activities, scientists are actually somewhat more open to the notion of the soul. I mean, even Dawkins admits that as far as consciousness is concerned, science has not yet succeeded in killing the soul. So consider a typical discussion of consciousness and other emergent properties found in like a basic biology textbook. Here's a quote. Every level of organization has properties called emergent properties that are not found at lower levels. Many emergent properties of systems result from interactions among their parts. Examples of properties that emerge through complex interactions are memory, learning, consciousness, and emotions such as hate, fear, and so forth. These properties result from interactions in the human brain among the trillion cells with their quadrillion connections. No single cell or even small groups of cells possesses them. Emergent properties do not violate principles that operate at lower levels of organization. However, emergent properties usually cannot be detected or even suspected by studying the lower levels. Biologists could never discover the existence of human emotions by studying single nerve cells, even though they may be able to eventually explain those emotions in terms of the interaction among many nerve cells. Okay? So here's the question that Marty was raising towards the end of his talk. Okay? The question to ask regarding emergent properties is whether they're simply collective properties, in which case we simply have a more developed form of materialism, or whether they are properties that are not fully explainable in terms of the material parts involved and their interactions. Many collective wholes manifest properties that go beyond what any individual part could do. A group can move a piece of furniture that an individual could not. A bicycle can serve as a means of transportation, and a pedal cannot. A lone individual cannot play football. Okay? So the things that collective wholes can do, however, the things that collective wholes can do are things which can be traced back to the individual parts and their interactions. That's all there is, okay? However, are there properties that can't be fully explained by the parts and their interaction? To me, that's a truly emergent property, okay? So the biology book I was just quoting favors the view that consciousness and emotion and so forth can finally be traced back to a lot of neurons interacting, okay? But that's it. Okay, but I think that the optimism that an understanding of perception, consciousness, emotion, and so forth is going to be understood in terms of how many cells are working together is ill-founded for these reasons, okay? For example, if it were possible to present a deaf person with a complete biological account of all the parts involved in hearing, along with the way these parts interact when people hear, the deaf person still would not understand what hearing was. The closest one could get to conveying what hearing was to a deaf person would not be in the scientific terms of biology, but in terms of everyday experience. One could tell the person that just as seeing is awareness of color and tasting is awareness of flavor, so too there's another form of awareness that bears on some other type of sensible quality. Okay? That's the best way to get across what hearing is, not through a bunch of details about neurons interacting. Okay? Similarly, a description of the physical changes occurring in a person who feels fear, no matter how detailed, would not provide a complete account of fear. Ordinarily, when we feel fear, we're aware of a future evil difficult to avoid. Although the feeling of fear is not independent of a certain bodily state, it cannot be fully explained in terms of this state. If we asked a person, why are you afraid, and got as a response that the hormone epinephrine was acting on her heart cells and so forth, we would not be satisfied. Fear is ordinarily fear of something, just as sadness is sadness about something. It's not like growing taller. Any number of questions can be asked about fear that have no reference to physical factors. For example, can fear itself be feared? Is having a defect, some defect, a cause of fear? Emotion is not the same sort of thing as surface tension, which we can understand once we better understand water molecules. Okay, so that would be an example of what I consider a collective property. Okay, so for Aristotle, the soul is what makes the cells in the eye that are coordinated with other cells in the brain capable of being an instrument of sight in the living thing. The eye apart from the living thing is only an eye by metaphor. The cause which makes a thing one living substance is the same cause which enables the parts of this thing to do more than a mere collection of parts is capable of. One might object and say positing a soul to explain perception, emotion, consciousness does nothing to advance our understanding of these phenomena. Aristotle does not just posit the soul as a cause, but investigates what sort of cause it must be. Determining that a substantial form is the only adequate cause for why living things manifest properties not found in complex wholes that lack substantial unity is to understand something about living things, albeit something very general. I think that's the other huge problem, is biologists always want something really detailed. So you give them an explanation that's too general, it's like you're not saying anything. But maybe that's the only type of explanation that we can give for these things. Okay? So while speaking of the soul as a substantial form of the living body does not explain why these specific parts and chemical substances allow for this sort of perception any more than the reductionist count does, okay? At the same time, it does point to the need to investigate the psychic or mental aspects of perception and emotion, and not just their physical substrate. Aristotle says the true natural scientist is not going to understand anger solely as, quote, a boiling of blood or warm substance around the heart, but also as returning pain for pain, or something like that, end quote. The failure to recognize that animal behavior involves more than the sort of physical changes found in non-living things had a negative impact on how research on animals was carried on. Ethology, the study of animal behavior, was slow to develop because many of its early practitioners worked on the general assumption that animals were devoid of consciousness, empathy, or any sort of mental state. James Watson, one of the founders of behaviorism, articulates his approach thus, quote, the rule or measuring rod which the behaviorist puts in front of him always is, can I describe this bit of behavior I see in terms of stimulus and response? By stimulus, we mean any object in the general environment and any change in the tissues themselves due to the physiological condition of the animal, such as a change we get when we keep an animal from sex activity, when we keep it from feeding, when we keep it from building a nest. By response, we mean anything the animal does, such as turning toward or away from a light, jumping at a sound, and more highly organized activities such as building a skyscraper. Behaviorism claims that consciousness is neither a definite nor usable concept. The behaviorist, who has been trained always as an experimentalist, holds further that belief in the existence of consciousness goes back to the ancient day of superstition and magic, end quote. Well, this approach slowed the development of ethology. Okay? Biology would have done better to have followed Aristotle in recognizing the psychic abilities and what we more commonly refer to as mental states in animals. The first thing Aristotle investigates in regard to animals are the individual external senses. After all, that's what makes an animal and not a plant. It can sense. Next, the nature of sense perception in general, then consciousness, imagination, emotion, and other related activities. All those properties of animals that cannot be fully accounted for in a mechanistic way. It's not that Aristotle thinks the material aspects of these life activities are unimportant. Indeed, in his initial discussion of the different external senses, he speaks quite a bit about the physical causes involved, including the role of light in vision, the physical requirements for sound production, and the physiological requirements for an animal to have a voice. However, instead of continuing in the direction of examining the material parts in more detail, which is something that he does do in the parts of animals, his first priority is to examine those aspects of sensation which stem from living things having souls, such as consciousness. Now, one might argue that a biologist need not espouse the Aristotelian notion of soul to recognize that an important part of understanding animals is to investigate their mental abilities. After all, Donald Griffin, author of Animal Minds, and a major figure urging those studying animal behavior to break away from purely behaviorist approaches, had this to say about the soul, quote, "I will take it for granted that behavior and consciousness in both animals and men result entirely from events that occur in their central nervous systems. In other words, I will operate on the basis of emergent materialism and assume that there are no immaterial, vitalistic, or supernatural processes involved in the small fraction of human or animal brain events that result in conscious, subjective thoughts and feelings," end quote. It's hard to see how Griffin's emergent materialism is finally any different than crude reductionism. The emergent properties of animals and humans, again to quote, result entirely from events that occur in their central nervous systems. They're collective properties at most. As argued above, this view does not do justice to life activities such as sense perception and emotion. In addition, we see in Griffin an a priori commitment to materialism. It might seem that adopting a view that acknowledges the presence of emergent properties in living things suffices for one to examine these properties. However, materialism tends to blind one to evidence of differences in certain mental phenomena. Consider Griffin's failure to entertain the evidence that self-consciousness is radically different from mere consciousness. And this is such a common confusion. People conflate consciousness with self-consciousness, okay? So in Animal Minds, Griffin initially acknowledges there is little evidence that animals have reflective consciousness or self-consciousness. Towards the end of Animal Minds, Griffin concludes, quote, "If we grant that animals are capable of perceptual awareness, denying them some level of self-awareness would seem to be an arbitrary and unjustified restriction," end quote. And this is how he tries to argue his case, quote, "When an animal consciously perceives the running, climbing, or moth chasing of another animal, it must also be aware of who is doing these things. And if the animal is perceptually conscious of its own body, then it's difficult to rule out similar recognition that it itself is doing the running, climbing, or chasing," end quote. There's no argument here that the animal is more than conscious of its body. What is the evidence that it's self-consciously aware that it's running or climbing? Most of the time, we do things without being self-consciously aware that we're doing them. For example, when I eat, I know when the food has arrived in my mouth because I don't start chewing before it has, right? Or that it's fallen off the fork. But most of the time, I'm not self-conscious when I eat, okay? So similarly, a dog knows that it's moving its paw or its paw's gotten stuck, okay? But what is the evidence that it is self-consciously aware of these things, okay? The hallmark of self-awareness or self-consciousness is to be able to mentally step back from what one is doing or planning to do to ask questions like, should I be doing this? What sort of person does these sorts of things? Do I want to be that type of person? Okay? Griffin is inclined to pass over such evidence because he's convinced that all human and animal behavior arises solely from the organization of material parts, and the said organization does not differ all that much between certain animals and ourselves. His materialism thus paves the way to equating body recognition with self-recognition. Griffin's emergent materialism allows him to escape, if only barely, from strict behaviorism, which denies any mental life to animals. But emergent or not, materialism proves to be a handicap when it comes to teasing apart certain differences in mental states. All right, here's a very short section, I had to cut this one back, on the biologist's need for natural philosophy. Quite a few biologists accept the notion of soul, at least one of the religious notions of soul, as something of a spiritual nature found only in humans. Even those who do not manifest Dawkinesque hostility towards the notion of soul, and who think they have a soul, generally do not see their notion of soul as having anything to do with biology. Yet, as argued above, there are costs attached to dispensing with the notion of soul. First, one either ends up denying the unity and self-motion of organisms, or that there must be a cause for these unique properties. Secondly, one either ends up denying that consciousness and emotion are not fully explicable by interacting material parts, or one fails to recognize that there must be a cause that adequately accounts for these unique properties. Perhaps the positions Aristotle adopts on these matters are incorrect. Still, biologists who have not investigated these fundamental questions concerning the nature of life are deficient in their understanding of life. In addition, the biologist, as biologists, would benefit from connecting the specific questions about living things that are amenable to scientific inquiry with the more general questions that natural philosophy studies. For as we have seen, the failure to do so can have a negative impact on the study of animal behavior and on animal minds. All right, the next section is on hierarchy. And as mentioned earlier, the common view among biologists is that human beings are just one species among many others, and every species has to be adapted to its environment, otherwise it doesn't survive, okay? So from this point of view, if any kind of organism is going to be called superior, it's going to be some type of bacteria, right? Because they're much more ancient and much more numerous. Now, Aristotle, to the contrary, maintains that there are different grades of life which represent a hierarchy of perfection. Some living things have more being and thus more goodness than others. For example, sensitive living things, animals, compared to plants, have more being because by sensing they in some way become other things, whereas plants are limited to being only themselves. Aristotle distinguishes two meanings of the word perfection. In one sense, one being can be more perfect than another insofar as it has more being. In another sense, a being is either perfect or imperfect insofar as it has or lacks the parts it's supposed to have to carry on its life. Looking to perfection in the second sense, Aristotle argues that shellfish are not imperfect in the sense of missing something, despite their inability to move about like other animals. Quote, "Nature does nothing in vain and omits nothing essential except in maimed or imperfect animals. And the sort of animal under consideration is perfect and not maimed. This is proved by the fact that they propagate their species and have a prime and decline." So the type of perfection and imperfection spoken of here corresponds to the biologist's notion of fitness and the lack thereof. Later on, however, Aristotle speaks of certain animals as being imperfect in another sense. Quote, "We must consider also in the case of imperfect animals, namely those which have no sense but touch, what it is in them that originates movement," end quote. So these animals are said here to be less perfect because they lack senses that the other animals have. A sense allows a being in some manner to be more than just itself. As Aristotle puts it in one place, quote, "The soul is in a certain sense all things," end quote. This is readily seen in the case of seeing something and later imagining it. You couldn't later imagine it unless when you initially saw it, it didn't somehow come to exist inside one, okay? So in a certain sense, sensation extends one's being, not one's substantial being. Obviously, you don't turn into the thing you look at, but in some sense, you do become that thing, okay? And to that extent, you're not limited to just being yourself, and therefore sense perception in a certain way extends your own being, allows you to be more than what you are, okay? And then Aristotle goes on to delineate a life form superior to the animal. This life form is capable of a further expansion of its being. Just as the sensitive soul is open to becoming all sensible things, so too the intellectual soul is open to becoming all intelligible things. The difference between the two types of knowledge lies in their objects. Quote, "What actual sensation apprehends as individuals, while what knowledge or episteme apprehends as universals," end quote. Intellectual knowledge surpasses sense knowledge both in the scope of things known and in how they're known. We can know the existence of things we cannot sense, such as UV light, and we can ask questions about the existence of things that are immaterial. And while our senses tell us what things look like and feel like and so forth, our intellects are capable of knowing what things are and why they are the way they are. For this reason, Aristotle would be in full accord with the philosopher Errol Harris, who dryly responds to those who see no hierarchy in nature. Quote, "It has been alleged that mosquitoes have been more successful in adapting themselves to wide differences in climate than have humans. No mosquito is capable of making such a reflection." End quote. All right, so the question of whether or not there's a difference between sense and intellect has, of course, been debated by philosophers throughout the ages. Should a biologist be concerned with the answer to this question, especially when philosophers can't seem to see clear on the issue? They should, because this answer is needed in order to determine the primary categories of life forms. And knowing these constitutes part of a general understanding of the biosphere. In addition, understanding whether and how sense and intellect differ holds importance for those areas of biology that study animal behavior. We saw this above with Griffin's facile attribution of self-reflection to animals. If indeed there is a radical difference between the capacity for abstract thought and sense perception, then the researchers who are unaware of this are at a loss when it comes to devising tests for animals that are adequate to showing whether or not animals have human-like intelligence. This problem comes up over and over when primatologists who have taught apes to use symbolic means of communication attempt to determine whether the apes are true language users. Language usage is often defined in terms of understanding what the words mean. But too often, understanding what the words mean is left undefined. The consequence of this has been that every time an ape passes a given language test, some philosopher comes along and shows why that test is inadequate for establishing true language usage. And that is historically true. My heart kind of goes out to them. These experimenters ignore philosophical discussions concerning the nature of language and the nature of rationality at their peril. All right, here's a section on the final cause. Of course, Aristotle gives pride of place to the final cause, and we know for a while biologists didn't like the notion of final cause. But pretty soon, you know, for a while they were saying, instead of saying the turtle came ashore in order to lay its eggs, the turtle came ashore and laid its eggs, okay? But pretty soon they realized this really doesn't work, okay? And if you look in any biology textbook today, the final cause is there. They changed the language, but the final cause is still there, okay? Now, where you do nonetheless see biologists still distancing themselves from the notion of teleology is in evolutionary biology, okay? And this is because it seems that in explaining the origin of the species, one has to choose one member of a dichotomy which pits action for an end against chance. This dichotomy was originally formulated by Aristotle. Quote, "Why then should it not be the same with parts in nature? For example, that our teeth should come up of necessity, the front teeth sharp, fitted for tearing, the molars broad and useful for grinding down food, since they did not arise for this end, but just happened by chance to be that way. And so with all the other parts in which we suppose that there is a purpose. Wherever then all the parts came about just the way they would have been if they had come to be for an end, such things survived, being by chance organized in a fitting way. Whereas those which grew otherwise perished and continue to perish. Yet it's impossible that this should be the true view, for teeth and all other natural things either invariably or normally come about in a given way. But not one of the results of chance is this true. If then it's agreed that things are either the result of chance or for an end, and these things can't be the result of chance, it follows that they must be for an end," end quote. But in the case of evolution, what is at stake is not whether organs have functions, but whether they initially arose due to chance or for the sake of something. When it comes to explaining the origin of the diverse species of animals with their adaptations, evolutionary biologists generally go with random variation and natural selection, rather than adopting Aristotle's preferred alternative of nature acting for an end. Now, in the physics, Aristotle engages in no further speculation as to whether there is an intelligence behind nature responsible for this ordering to an end. Indeed, throughout his opus, he never states in any clear way whether he takes this to indicate a mind behind nature. Of course, Thomas Aquinas and other thinkers are going to build on Aristotle and argue that finality in nature is reason to conclude to an intelligence behind nature, and that's what Marty was talking about with the arrow, okay? Now, evolutionary biologists who regard chance and necessity as the ultimate causes of organs that serve a purpose, not surprisingly conclude that positing an intelligence behind nature is superfluous, whence Dawkins claimed that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. It's not the biologist's task, however, to be answering the question of whether there is an intelligence behind the biosphere. Granted, the observations of the marvelous adaptations of living things naturally brings this question to mind. Unfortunately, many evolutionary biologists, as well as their critics, instead of remaining within the realm of biological explanation, pack into Darwin's biological theory of evolution a philosophical position about God. For example, biologist William Provine asserts that, quote, 9% of Americans polled accepted the scientific version of biological evolution, namely, that evolution has occurred over a long period of time and is a process not guided by God, end quote. And Christoph Cardinal Schoenberg writes, quote, evolution in the sense of common ancestry might be true, but evolution in the neo-Darwinian sense, an unguided, unplanned process of random variation and natural selection, is not, end quote. Now, what Schoenberg most likely means by neo-Darwinism is a philosophical position that some espouse as if it were a necessary consequence of neo-Darwinian biology. However, such affirmations contribute to the confusion about what statements about evolution pertain to biology and what statements about evolution pertain to philosophy. Now, biologists do rightly seek to investigate an issue that's closely related to the question of a mind behind nature, namely, whether the immediate causes of evolution are for the sake of something or are random. Whether mutation is random or directed is certainly something one can try to determine through experiments. The biologist, then, is subsequently faced with the need to answer the philosophical question of whether randomness is a reason to reject action for an end. An incorrect answer to this question would potentially prevent the biologist from seeing finality which is there. So we see here how the biologist's understanding of living things can be dependent upon the answer to a more general question concerning nature. Let us investigate the question about randomness in order to see in more detail how answers to philosophical questions sometimes have an impact on biology. Aristotle's chance-finality dichotomy makes it seem that randomness is in no wise reconcilable with action for an end. Yet while the two are mutually exclusive at the same level, since a process is called random because the causes operative are not tending to produce a specific outcome, nonetheless, such a process can be a means of achieving a goal at another level. Biology itself provides a beautiful example of how random processes not only can serve an end, but can be the most appropriate means to that end. The immune system of certain organisms produces millions of cells, each with a different antibody specificity. How does it do so? The variable regions of the antibody, which are what confer immunological specificity, result from genes that have been randomly shuffled. If the body only had a fixed set of foreign invaders it had to deal with, an arsenal of a fixed set of antibodies would do. However, given that viruses and bacteria evolve, the vastly greater variety of antibodies produced through the random gene mixing is the better design. We see then that the general reflections on the nature of random processes shows that they do not automatically exclude finality at another level. Adopting the opposite view constitutes an anti-scientific viewpoint to the extent that it prevents biologists from recognizing finality in instances where random processes are a means to achieving a goal. This anti-scientific position affects how biologists read life's story. Is evolution in some sense progressive and tending towards the production of a being like ourselves? Or does the randomness involved in the production of species mean that human beings are a sheer accident? Ernst Mayr adopts the latter position. Evolutionary research has found no evidence whatsoever for a goal-seeking of evolutionary lines. And Stephen Jay Gould heartily agrees, quote, Darwin maintained that evolution has no direction. It does not lead inevitably to higher things. Organisms become adapted to their local environments, and that is all, end quote. Now, the American Museum of Natural History takes this line of reasoning even a step further. Here's a quote: "From a philosophical perspective, the most important aspects of evolution is the rise of complex creatures from simple ones. This vertical dimension of evolution has been co-opted by those who proclaim it as evidence of an unseen creator. Wallace Arthur of the National University of Ireland attacks that anti-scientific worldview by building a persuasive picture of how unaided evolution produces advanced creatures from simple ones by an essentially accidental process," end quote. Now, the notion that there is a creator responsible for evolutionary processes does not constitute an anti-scientific worldview, as it in no wise interferes with scientific investigations of the immediate causes responsible for the origin of the various species. It's from our general understanding of the way nature is that reasonable attempts are made to establish the existence of God. It is not our knowledge of the existence or non-existence of God that serves to ground particular conclusions about the various specific features and behaviors of living things. The question of God's existence lies outside biology and has no impact on it. Again, what is an anti-scientific worldview is the mistaken adoption of the philosophical position that the blind causes involved in evolution necessarily mean that evolution cannot be tending to any goal. For this causes a potential misreading of life's story. The biological evidence for evolutionary trends or tendencies to certain goals is dismissed in advance on the grounds that evolution involves contingent and random causes and so can have no goals. This is my concluding section: philosophy, ally of biology. Throughout this paper, I have argued that biologists would stand to profit from greater familiarity with natural philosophy, both because they can gain an understanding of living things that complements the understanding obtained through biology, and also because their ability to do research in some cases depends on having in hand the correct answers to certain philosophical questions. There are truths about living things that can only be known by reflecting on our more general, non-experimental experience of them. This is the only way we're able to understand the unity of living things, their self-motion, the hierarchy of the different life forms, and also certain aspects of the mental abilities characteristic of higher living things. Mistakes about these issues not only constitute a failure to achieve a general understanding of life, they also often have negative repercussions on how biologists carry on the detailed studies of living things that are properly theirs. For example, incorrect answers given to the philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness and intelligence have led some biologists to deny that animals have minds, and others to commit a variety of mistakes in studying animal behavior, such as conflating body consciousness with self-consciousness. Lack of an educational acquaintance with natural philosophy can also lead biologists to make methodological mistakes of a general nature, such as starting the study of biology by examining the non-living parts of organisms, rather than the behavior of the organisms that are most manifestly alive. It is not only philosophical reflections that directly concern living things that the biologist has reason to take interest in. Familiarity with certain very general considerations of natural philosophy, such as those concerning the role of final cause in explanations, and of the relationship of chance and randomness to final causality, can also help students of life avoid errors such as refusing to give explanations in terms of final causes, and of denying the possibility that a given random process may be ordered to a goal at another level. In addition, biologists also need to be exposed to certain metaphysical questions concerning the nature of reality as a whole and concerning knowledge in general and scientific knowledge in particular. The need to do so is particularly acute in regard to three questions. The first question is that of whether everything that exists is material. To assume this in advance, instead of carefully considering all pertinent evidence, is plainly to abandon objectivity and to embrace an ideology. Here, fear of letting a divine foot in the door is often the motive for abandoning reason. The blind espousal of materialism affects the biologist's ability to come to a balanced judgment on important questions, such as those concerning hierarchy and finality in the living realm. The second question is whether adopting methodological reductionism as the working method for science commits one to ontological reductionism. Eddington's parable illustrates the obvious answer. One's method allows one to know a determinate kind of thing that exists. It does not determine what does or does not exist. Thus, it's one thing to say that one will attempt to explain some life activity in terms of the material parts involved. It's another to assume that such a method affords an entirely adequate way of treating all life activities. A further ill consequence of the unwarranted espousal of ontological reductionism, as if this were a logical consequence of accepting methodological reductionism, is that it helps fuel the myth that being a scientist is incompatible with being a religious believer. The third question concerns the relation of biology to other disciplines, and especially to the philosophical disciplines and to theology. The study of living things pertaining to natural philosophy is arguably continuous with biology. Still, each answers different sorts of questions about living things, generally using a different method. Philosophy clarifies very general concepts concerning living things, starting from common experience, whereas biology pursues a more detailed understanding of living things through experiment. Biologists need to be aware of this, and they also need to see that the answers to the more general questions of philosophy in some cases provide a framework for answering questions in biology. Nowadays, biologists especially need to understand the relation of their discipline to the various attempts by natural philosophers to argue from the order in living nature to a mind behind it. They should be aware that maintaining that there is a mind behind evolution does not constitute an anti-scientific worldview, and why it does not. It is when biologists fail to grasp what sort of questions biology can answer and what sort of questions fall to other disciplines to answer that they readily fall into errors such as defining evolution as an unguided, unplanned process of random variation and natural selection. Errors like these both vitiate the biologist's research and engender unwarranted conflict between science and religion. I rest my case that biologists who have acquired an educational acquaintance with certain philosophical questions pertaining to natural philosophy and to metaphysics will be both better biologists and better students of life in general. They will also be better equipped than the average biologist to avoid errors when examining philosophical questions concerning the relationship of science and religion. Once biologists integrate their study within a broader philosophical framework, then they will appreciate what Aristotle means when he suggests that an investigation of the soul stands to make a substantial contribution to the whole body of truth. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take about 5 minutes for discussion. Who has the first question? Yes, please.
Sorry.
Yeah. There will be no.
Yeah. I have to say, I'm a bit hesitant to say anything because I find myself completely reflected in the philosophy.
There is not on.
Oh, sorry.
That's on. Thank you. No, I was saying I'm really hesitant to say anything because I think I find myself completely reflected in the philosophical ignorance that we biologists suffer from that you just described. So I want to make 2 comments and ask a question, and that all stems from that ignorance. The first one regards the randomness that you mentioned towards the end of your talk. And we biologists don't think of randomness as a total randomness. And I give you an example. There are in biology what we call evolutionary landscapes. And if I understand correctly the concept, it means that once an organism is committed into a particular evolutionary pathway, it can move only within a limited landscape. So what is random is the possibilities or the pathways that organism can take within that limited landscape. So it's not total randomness what we endorse. And the second comment regards consciousness. And Many biologists will consider consciousness as an evolutionary adaptation. Therefore, in that regard, humans are not higher or lower in the scale of life than any other forms. So we have only different adaptations, and I would like to know how you would respond to that. And my question, the final question is: you mentioned about consciousness as an emergent property, which I find really appealing, but you haven't mentioned or you haven't said anything about how that view is compatible with the idea of the soul as created from God. So.
Okay, well, starting with the point about randomness, I understand your point, because biologists will argue, are mutations entirely random? I looked up, you Google that, and you'll see a series of papers, and some say yeah, and others say no. And a lot of people will say what you just said, and it does make sense to me. But at any rate, whether it's truly the case, as I was saying, in biology, it's a legitimate biological question to try to figure out, is this entirely random or not? Last evening, there was a biologist there who was pointing out that certain parts of the DNA mutate more rapidly than other parts. Well, if it's purely random, how can that be? It doesn't seem to fit with pure randomness, okay? But at any rate, what happens, though, is the notion of randomness then, whether it's rightly or wrongly taken from biology, is used to mount a philosophical position saying that there can't be any finality there. And that's basically what I'm trying to address. I'm not really capable of answering that biological question, which is, I think, a very important question. But what I'm objecting to is that if they say that there's randomness there, rightly or wrongly, that then this is not used then as a step to denying that there could be some sort of order behind nature. Your second question was about consciousness, is that correct? And you're wondering how I don't mention the human soul. Well, I think that consciousness is already present in animals, right? You read that story about the ape that plans and rips off pieces of the wall to throw them at the spectators, okay? And is very smart, you know, he hides them and he waits for them to come, but he's got his cache there, you know? So obviously it's planning. Are you going to tell me this being isn't conscious? Sure, it's conscious, okay? So I don't think that you have to bring in something immaterial in order to talk about the soul, okay? That's, again, a religious concept of soul that we have to the extent we're familiar with, you know, Judeo-Christian religions, that sort of thing. But Aristotle's notion of the soul is not that of something immaterial. He is talking about first, and this is a really hard concept to get across, you have to look at a lot of things, but his whole notion of substantial form is something which is not necessarily something which is immaterial. Anything that is a unified being, okay, has got to have something that makes it one unified being. And that is what philosophers refer to as a substantial form. And for Aristotle, the soul is just one type of substantial form. Like in other natural things that are not alive, if it's one type of thing, okay, if it's one being, it's got to have one substantial form. So I don't want to say consciousness equals immateriality. I wouldn't hold that. I would have to look to see what type of consciousness there was. That's why I think it's hugely important to distinguish between consciousness and self-consciousness, because I think at the latter you might have to bring in something immaterial, but for the former, I think the evidence is against that. And then you had a third question. What was it again? I'm sorry.
Well, actually, I think I meant self-consciousness, not consciousness.
Consciousness? Okay.
Yes.